So this morning we're going to talk about how international collaboration can enable some of that kind of technological advantage and competitive commercial and military advantage that I talked about in my presentation. I think we probably owe you as an audience a bit of an introduction into what the Hiroshima Accord was. And to do that, I'm going to ask, first of all, Alessio to start by answering the question, where, how and why did Japan and the UK's interests align such that the Hiroshima Accord was even possible? So thinking a bit back before the Accord, how do we get there, really, is the question.
Keith, this is a very important question because I think it strikes at the heart of something you said at the very beginning of your presentation. I think so. I can hear myself yeah. So it strikes at the heart of something you said at the very beginning of your talk earlier on today, which I think is true in particular right now when we're talking about the fact that you need to think about how do you imagine the future to unfold rather than following technology first and then you align technology behind that. And so looking at history of where we come from, it kind of reinforces that because it tells you something about why it is important to do things together and why certain partners decided to work together. And the Hiroshima Accord is, if you want, a very significant step in a recognition of a transformation that both Japan and the UK underwent in the previous 10 years. I would say there's 3 points really for us to think about when we want to look back where the Hiroshima Accords are coming from. First of all, there is a significant alignment that really took shape between 2010 and 2021 between the UK and Japan in terms of worldview. What are the key challenges of the future ahead? And we started at the beginning of the 2010s with 2 very different positions because the UK was very much in the global war on terror kind of space. It was non-state-led challenges. The war in Afghanistan and Iraq were absolutely central. They were central to the Defense Review of 2010, 2015, and then the relevant updates. And that was a very different place from where Japan was because ever since the beginning of the 2010, Japan was coming on the back of a very naughty North Korea DPRK with a number of improvements there, missile and nuclear programs. And then between 2012 and 2014, you've got the tensions with China. So whereas the UK starts at the 2010 in a place whereby non-state challenges are the key thing to think about in national security, Japan was firmly into the camp, actually, these matter, but at the same time, state-on-state contestation still remains very much front and center. And you see this in 2013, the first national security strategy in Japan. It's very much a strategy that is almost seen as out of touch with where most of the rest of the Western industrialized world was in terms of order of priority. But really that changes. And I think we land in 2021 with the integrated review in the UK and then the new national security strategy in Japan in 2022, where the worldview is much more aligned. State-on-state contestation is shared in both countries as one of the key challenges. A challenge that does not mean that non-state threats disappear, but they are on a different sort of scale, and they sit next to other existential challenges such as climate change. But I would say it's really interesting to see this sort of a journey whereby we see 2 countries that had a really good defense relationship to begin with, but they really sort of start in 2 different corners of the world with 2 very different worldviews about the priorities of national security, and they end up in a very similar space. So the worldview alignment, I think, is the first point. The second thing to think about is how both Japan and the UK recast their perception of self in terms of stakeholders and contributors to international security. And for the UK, 2012 onwards, when the first announcement around potential base facilities in Dhaka comes about, it's about regaining an understanding of the extent to which the UK needs, should, and would engage with the Indo-Pacific, and the opposite journey for Japan, coming out of, particularly under the Abe years, not just focusing on Northeast Asia, but increasingly more in an international environment. And here perhaps one point to raise is this very signposting event of the 2015 Japan joining CTF 151 taking for the first time leadership on an international activity around the counter-piracy that was not US-centric, and it was outside
CTF,
the umbrella.
Alessio, for...
Yes, Combined Task Force, out in Bahrain, in the Western Indian Ocean. So, and in that sense, 2018 is the equivalent for the UK, when for the first time after 5 years of absence, HMS Sutherland becomes the first frigate to be deployed in the region, and in fact the first also European surface combatant to join Japan in tackling the ship-on-ship transfer that was taking place in light of the resolution of the UN to control North Koreans' illegal components of missile and weapons of mass destruction programs. So that sort of recasting of the self, both for the UK in the Indo-Pacific and Japan internationally, closer to Europe, I think that's really important. And the third factor is how these two elements combined to reshape and recast the perception of where developing advanced capabilities fit in the context of national security, and in particular, the type of partnerships that are desirable to do so. And there you see Japan between 2013 and 22 to really go through a serious problems of revising its incredible constraints on any types of arms sales and joining international cooperation projects. And for the UK, partly because of Brexit, rethinking how to do business with in a context whereby you need to have economies that have that kind of industrial, technological and science edge, in which then the seeing and finding each other became natural. So 3 things to understand where the Hiroshima Accord are coming from. One, that sort of conceptualization of worldview that sees an enormous amount of alignment by the early 2020. 2, the recasting of a sense of self and international role for both the UK and Japan. And 3, the role that defense industry and technological sort of advanced capabilities fit, and who you do that with beyond the usual partners.
So worldview, recasting of self, and ultimately the fit of the two countries. I think I might add to that alignment as well the fact that the world's largest middle class is now in the Indo-Pacific, right? So, like if you're going to do business, where else would you want to be doing it? And a lot of the growth in the Indo-Pacific is being funded by Japanese investment banks and enabled by their quality infrastructure program, which I think still spends more globally, not just in the region, than China's Belt and Road Initiative that gets a lot more attention. So
absolutely.
Some other things commercially that build on that. So if Alessio told us how we kind of got to a point where the Hiroshima Accord was possible, Sophia, could I ask you to come in on like what are the key components of that enhanced global strategic partnership that I think was the kind of headline thing to come out? Like, so another way of saying it's like, what was the Hiroshima Accord for those who perhaps are not on top of the fine detail?
So I would start again at the point just to re-emphasize what Alessio said about this shared worldview. And the reason I just want to drill that home is because we often express a kind of commonality of a worldview with a lot of our allies and partners, but I think the British-Japanese commonality here is actually quite distinct, and it is something that flows into the Hiroshima Accord in a way that is absolutely evident if you read all the documents associated with and the speeches. I mean, even amongst our other G7 allies, this question around common perception of this strategic outlook, there's actually still quite a lot of diversity there. This is why it has been so challenging and taken such a long time for forums such as NATO and so on to actually address questions of China and the kind of broader strategic context outside of the region. So it's that shared strategic outlook, but it's also, and this is where the partnership documents really come in to play, it's a shared understanding of the instruments that both countries have to respond to this outlook, to achieve both deterrence and enhance our competitiveness, both individually and collectively. So there are 3 kind of key components to the partnership. And the first one of these, this is something I'm I work very passionately on, and where I do think Britain and Japan are the guardians of, which is the indivisibility doctrine between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security theaters. It is really, really one of the most significant developments over the past decade that these two G7 powers have really taken up that mantle. And if you think about the other views within the G7 on this, some of the unpredictabilities of the views in Washington on this, it has been really essential to have that long-term resilience of two guardians of that doctrine. And that is why, as we have had a change of government here, it's been so important. And I've been trying to do a lot of work behind the scenes to make sure that that continues to be upheld, and we might get into that conversation a little bit more in the discussion. But the indivisibility doctrine between the security theaters basically recognizes that these are completely inseparable, not just in terms of actors, and obviously there's been some pretty concerning developments around the integration of threats, but also that our prosperity and stability of the international order is fundamentally decided in these two theaters. And that in a time of really constrained resources, some degree of prioritization is really, really important. And these are the two spaces that we need to play in. The second kind of thematic area that really comes up in this partnership is this idea of the integration of economic and national security objectives, particularly around advanced tech and innovation. So this is another area in which we don't just share the same outlook, we have the same diagnosis about the instruments and assets that we have to respond to them. Both countries are putting advanced tech capabilities at the heart of our economic growth strategy and our national security agenda. This is how, through cooperation, we will deter. It's also how we will remain prosperous. The third area is around kind of net zero and clean energy. This is sort of advanced manufacturing. There are relationships with the sort of advanced tech story as well. But I think what's really, really interesting about this is, again, you see there is a moral mission to this. It is about the international order, because this is an issue that brings the whole global community together, and in which both countries feel we have a leadership stake. But this is also an area where both countries recognize that particularly China has made net zero quite central to its economic competitiveness strategy. So there is a kind of deterrence function as well for us really making the most of our capabilities in this area. So I think, it's a really, really interesting partnership, because it speaks to shared values, shared outlook, shared capabilities, and it's both kind of warm in a way that is familiar to us with alliances, but it's also really sharp-eyed and hard-nosed in a way that I think really reflects the demands of the contemporary environment.
I like sharp-eyed and hard-nosed a lot. I should be stealing it. Al, if I can come to you, I know that we've been doing some work on lessons from Ukraine for the defense of Japan, but if we stick here to just Japan, what are Japan's principal military and defense concerns? Like, what is Japan worried about?
So I'm slightly wary about talking about this in front of two Japan experts, which is always a bit of a danger. So I'm going to say some things that I think are really obvious, and then a few things that I think maybe should be obvious, but we don't pay enough attention to. So first of all, Japan is a lovely place in a slightly sketchy neighborhood. So they've got three problematic neighbors, and each of them represents a different form of threat. So on one scale, Japan has for some time now already been conducting civil defense drills because one of their neighbors likes to fire ballistic missiles literally across the top of their country to land in the sea on the other side. They also are an enabler of the world's fastest growing economy for some years, and now soon to become one of the richest and most powerful and most industrialized nations that has disputes over territory. And then they're probably one of their other big wake-up calls that they, I think, have recognized in a way that many other democratic nations haven't, has been the shock of Ukraine, and they are a neighbor to Russia all the way over there as well as we are here, and how they have treated the Ukrainian invasion as another step towards realizing the potential risks that live in that world. And that is also a nation of which they have territorial disputes, is a key factor. There are a number of flashpoints that they're intimately tied into, so it's not just missiles over the top of Ukraine. There's obviously their commitment to Taiwan, their concerns about the peninsula in South Korea, and a number of friends that they're keen to foster. So whenever they talk about this, they always mention, so America is the really obvious one with a large basing there, but they always mention Australia, they always mention South Korea, and they also always mention India as well. So if they're looking for a large counterbalancing force, that's another democracy. All of those feature in their conversations, but there is another element, I think, in their military concerns, which is one that pretty much all militaries have these days, which is the changing technological pace and what that means for the structures they have. So if you look at the Japanese Self-Defense Force, it has a really large, very capable navy. They have the second largest number of F-35s in the world. And yet, against that, we're already seeing all of those countries which have similar attributes try and worry about some of the new threats and scale that emerge from emerging technologies. So not all technology advances at a uniform rate. So the the heavy machine gun hasn't really changed its design since the end of the First World War. It's optimal, it's plateaued. To expect it to be radically new next week, it would be a strange decision. And yet the amount of technology we've seen change in computation and algorithms dwarfs that, as Keith did in an earlier speech, so I don't need to repeat it. But what that means is the democratization of precision. So things that used to be purely the purview of the richest nations are now being able to be reproduced by some of the poorest nations. So you can look at Yemen, arguably on some metrics, the 14th poorest nation in the world, admittedly with outside help, is producing unmanned surface vehicles, UAVs, and ballistic missiles that is threatening shipping in the Red Sea in a way that is demanding high-end first world capabilities at an inordinate expense to protect even more expensive commercial shipping that is then being driven somewhere else. So how we cope with the depth of magazine required to cope with the cheap and capable, while also maintaining those things which we would require to deal with the most exquisite. So if you can shoot down a drone that costs tens of dollars with tens of cents worth of countermeasure, so you're firing a heavy machine gun at it, that's great. You probably had to line all your radars up and make all that sort of stuff work. The odds that will also work for the incoming ballistic missile are essentially zero. So there are no easy, nice, simple, we used to do this and now we do that. We used to do horses, now we do armoured cars. It doesn't work that simply. So Japan also has to face the same sort of challenge and threat that I think people here are struggling with as well. And a lot of that is tied with what people would see in the background here. So Keith had talked about seeing all the constituents to the jigsaw. I mean, what this is an epicenter of supply lines, and how those come together, I think, is really, really important. And that is a key challenge for Japan, to understand what it needs to host, how it hosts it, and what will enable it to do both the high volume and the exquisite.
Thanks very much. I think having sort of set up like where we came from, how we got here, and what the challenges Japan faces kind of militarily, maybe the next place to usually go is that thing that's very active in policy debates that Sophia touched on, which is making the case for the indivisibility of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. I'm interested in how each of you might make that case, and then therefore what conclusions you draw from it. So how would you make the case for the kind of indivisibility of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, and then what, having made that case, so what? Like, what does that mean for us in the UK and Japan? Sophia, if I can put you straight in the spotlight as somebody who I know has done a lot of thinking on this, slightly unfairly, because you get bounced while others get a chance to think.
Well, this for me is a project about keeping Britain focused on the Indo-Pacific, but also keeping Indo-Pacific partners focused on the Euro-Atlantic. So as well as harassing the British government on these matters, I've been down in Canberra 3 times this year, and, you know, working when we were doing the Auckland, the UK-Australia 2x2, you know, the robust discussion in that was really around Ukraine, right? Because, and this is where the Japan example is so important, because when a country like Australia says, well, you know, we have to focus on our region, understandably, so, you know, where Ukraine becomes a kind of second-order issue, you can point to Japan and say, well, actually, you know, Japan, another Indo-Pacific partner, doesn't feel that it's a second-order issue, because what they understand is that if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, the regional security environment in the Indo-Pacific deteriorates substantively and immediately, right? So the opportunity costs for Indo-Pacific powers are really, really significant. And Japan has been so instrumental in leadership on this point, and it's allowed that point of comparison. So this is, for me, I'm thinking about this in terms of the long-term resilience of the agenda, and it's something that has to be upheld from both sides. Now, in terms of how to make the case here, I think it is fair to say that because Labour had not been empowered during this enormous shift that has taken place in threat perceptions regarding China and the deterioration of the international environment, that they were perhaps less served, and also, to be fair, they had also not been privy to a lot of the intelligence briefings that had taken place, within government. So because they were outside of that story, they hadn't been on that journey from within the heart of government, and their expertise was, very strong in a lot of areas, but Indo-Pacific, China, strategic competition is not something that had been, a huge natural fit for some parts of their kind of foreign policy apparatus. So they've been having to kind of really get up to speed. And I have to say, I've been very impressed with how enthusiastically they have taken, to that process. But I do think, helping them to understand the integration of threats, and, if we're talking about, the coming together of our economic and national security objectives, one of those, one component of that is the coming together of economic and national security risks, and destabilization in one area is going to have really significant flow-on effects. We're in an age now where things like de-risking, where sanctions and so on are just becoming a bread and butter part of how we are having to do our foreign policy. So I think the integration of instruments, the integration of threats, once you get your head around that, I don't think it is difficult to understand why these issues need to be thought about coherently. And I will just finish by saying the British people actually get this, and this indivisibility doctrine. And the moment that it all came together for them was after the Russian invasion, when President Xi went to Moscow to see President Putin. I was doing focus groups at the time for the government on how all of this was playing with the British people. They watched that very, very closely. They had expected, a lot of British people had expected, that Xi was there to negotiate peace, to encourage Putin to step down. When he left Moscow after 4 days without having achieved any of that, and in fact, China has increased its material commitments to supporting Russia's illegal war against a sovereign power, I think it really hit home for the British people that these threats are connected. So the British people are in the right place on this. Government, the new government's been on a journey very quickly on this. So I think we are in the right posture on this. But I have to say that the culture within government and within all parts of government on this, and being really focused on the Indo-Pacific and understanding that story of the relationships between the two, is quite thin. It is a new culture, and it hasn't really seeped into the DNA in the way that a lot of other things which we know to be true, for example, understanding Russia as our kind of primary immediate threat, it's not as sunk in as some of those things. So it is going to need really constant agitation, attention, and advocacy to make sure that we keep this going and keep it resilient.
And completely confident we can rely on you and the man who looks like he's eager to speak into the microphone to do just that. Alessio, did you want to?
No, I'll just do two quick things, because I think Sophia very comprehensively covered the why, right? And then it goes back to the point about commonality of worldview and how you structure, if you want, in grand strategic level, the priorities of national security. I want to touch a little bit about on the what and the how. Right, because at the end of the day, yes, they are absolutely indivisible, but at the same time, I think we would be remiss not to acknowledge that if you are in main building at MOD at the moment, what you're really focusing on and you're zooming in is the Excel spreadsheet on all your programs and how you shield them from being axed from Treasury. Really, that's what it comes down to at the end of the day. It's not very sort of pleasantly strategic, I must say, but that's the hard reality of it. And to me, there's two things, therefore, that one needs to constantly hammer home in this space. One, and here I'm focusing on the Indo-Pacific and in particular sort of the Japan and Japan-related space. Let's be absolutely honest. Both AUKUS, and here I'm not talking about just Pillar 1, but also Pillar 2.
So submarines, Pillar 1, innovation, Pillar 2.
And Pillar 2 is innovation, particularly the Pillar 2 aspects, which, as we all know from a couple of months ago, has seen Japan being talked about as a potential partner on specific projects. And the timelines, let's park the timelines for a second about that, but the key thing is, what we're talking about here is that AUKUS and GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program, they focus on type of capabilities that are going to be absolutely central in a contested world in which maritime and air capabilities, in particular, capabilities that deliver in the sort of like undersea, seabed warfare space, as well as in air, both enabled and propelled by space and AI, it's going to be absolutely critical. Now, if we agree on the proposition that the British government's most significant defense collaborations in the Indo-Pacific are around or revolve around critical capabilities in crucial domains, then the next thing that goes with that is to reflect upon the fact that, and I'm going to be absolutely radical, you can use planes.
Never.
I'm going to be totally radical here, right? You can use submarine in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. That's a revolutionary idea.
Yep.
And you can use plane in the skies of the Pacific as well as the North Atlantic. Now, how radical is that, right? Because I think that there is a false dichotomy here when we're talking about Euro-Atlantic versus Indo-Pacific. And that false dichotomy,
yeah.
it's implicitly assuming that geography is a limitation. But I would say that from a technology perspective and capabilities that unfold from these crucial cooperations, first of all, is geographically agnostic, right? But they are geopolitically relevant for the type of challenges that we face. And I think we need to start articulating that narrative more frequently, because as I said, SSN AUKUS, I am pretty sure will work out fine beneath the waves of the Atlantic as it will in the Indian Ocean or in the Pacific. And the same way, I would imagine, right, a very big bomber would work really well if you look in Russia coming our way or coming from Japan's way. But on the how do, so for me the case from a technology point of view is geographically agnostic, is geopolitically enabled, and it really revolves around the crucial importance of these two domains to thinking about the way in which warfare is changing. But in terms of how, there will still be a question, if you are in main building, how do I distribute my limited bandwidth in between that Europe first and everything else after that? And to me here, the key notion to start thinking about, it's a NATO first, NATO with. And by that I mean, NATO is certainly going to be at the forefront of considerations for the British government, but NATO also is the main framework that links Europe from a hardcore security perspective to the Indo-Pacific through the collaborations with the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4, of which Japan and Australia are both a key component together with South Korea, three countries that are all very important and matter to the British government. So in that sense, I think as a format, thinking about how to see converging elements of priority that the government is looking at with opportunities that exist already is going to be the best way to maximize the limited bandwidth that one might have.
Very good. I'm going to come to you on the same subject of the indivisibility of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, but from a slightly different angle. I'm interested in what you think that might mean for the defence industrial base specifically, and then we might open that up also into the wider kind of idea of geoeconomics, and then that might perhaps draw Alessio and Sophia back in. Just before you do come in, I want to say, so you all know we've got 10 minutes, so probably we'll do this and then we'll probably have some closing comments from each of you.
I'm pleased you framed it in that way because it lets me do one of the more fun things, which is to disagree with someone on a panel. I'm going to disagree with you because you described the UK population as getting it. I think intellectually they do in some ways, but the emotional resonance I don't think is anywhere near as strong. And one of the things I have a fear about, and I think it exists at different levels. So you can see we've seen the move to 2.5% GDP in the UK. We've seen the increase in Japanese defence expenditure, but it hasn't been associated with any sense of urgency. And that's the bit where I think people are failing to make that recognition. So, and we can kind of look at some of the elements that describe that. So if you look at Pillar 1, I think the first Virginia-class submarine goes to Australia, so not Japan, but Australia in 2032. So that's a long, long way away. So that's a very long time frame under which these things are potentially being conducted. And we have open source reporting that trouble is likely to be much, much nearer than that. There is a great quote someone said, which is, I do not know what the Third World War would be fought with, but I'm sure that the fourth one would be fought with sticks and stones. I'm slightly concerned that people think that the Third World War might be fought with announcements, because the title of this, Turning the Hiroshima Accord into Action, I think is a key part of that. So having made valuable declarations that we're all in it together, which I agree with you on, I think that interdependency is really strong. I think it has to turn into something really useful. And, AUKUS, the Japan addition to AUKUS, and Pillar 2, and starting to address some of those high-volume, low-cost, rapid manufacturing challenges, I think might be the place where the interdependency and cooperation could turn into the earlier form of action that we would need to see for it to be effective. And that does, I think, play to geoeconomics in the sense that you have different strengths in different countries. You also have resilience across different countries as well. So if one country becomes isolated, its ability to maintain its supply chains, ability to do reinforcement becomes hugely problematic. And we can see from the influence in Ukraine of donations, albeit still insufficient, it has been very valuable to their ability to maintain that fight. So I think how we do that cooperation between countries is going to be hugely valuable, and it will be about technology sharing, concept sharing as well, I think, frankly. So going back to some of your talk where you describe what might be possible and use that as a means to start to cohere what you start to develop as technology could be hugely powerful. But unless there is substantive action, all that will happen is we will have a few less reds on the Excel spreadsheet that Alessio described in the MOD, where they've got slightly more funding for some of the lines they have, but they'll all arrive in 2035, 2040.
I think we should give Sophia a right of reply at that point.
Yes, men love on panels to make a big deal about how they're disagreeing with me. So usually about a theme on which I've done an enormous amount of research. So I really love when men do this. No, look, I do think that the British people's interest in these areas is underestimated and poorly understood. In fact, some polling that I did in around the Taiwan elections in January was very instructive on this. With the exception of sending British troops, which actually a plurality still a pretty significant proportion of the population actually support. Really? The British people supported an enormous range of British interventions should China pursue a kinetic warfare towards Taiwan. And, I think one of the reasons that they feel this way is because the British people are rather distinct amongst Western partners in that they are very conscious of the idea of the international order, perhaps because we played a very large role in creating it, but also they are extremely alliance-oriented and more so than any of the other G7 countries. The British people will name 10 different countries that they regard as allies. Most other G7 partners, it's about 2 to 3. So I think for all these reasons, the British people can think in abstract ways. Absolutely, Russia remains preeminent in their mind as the most vital kind of visceral threat, and there is still a lot of work to do to get the British people to understand the nature of the threat from China. But it is coming more into view. The British people are very attuned to cyber threats, so they are. I think that's also played a role, because obviously China is extremely active in this area, as are friends in the security services have made clear. So I think, we are in agreement that a lot more work needs to be done on this, and no one can be complacent on it. But I do think that the idea of disinterest and disengagement from the British people should not be a barrier here, because in some ways and on so many issues, they've actually been ahead of where government has been. They had a lot of the realizations earlier than our institutions have. So I'm pretty optimistic about that. But I think the core of all of this is that we do need to start having much more frequent, more serious conversations with citizens about what is at stake here and their role in that too. Because there was this brief moment earlier in the year where we started having some senior public officials talking quite openly about the reality of the threats that we're facing, and they ended up sort of being, there was then a push from Number 10 to kind of step down from that and kind of back away from that and say, oh, we don't want to scare the British people. I don't think we're doing a service to anybody by kind of backing away in that frame. The British people need to understand, because, if we come back and to your point on AUKUS and to Alessio's point about the significance of this, these are really expensive investments. We are in a time of constrained resources. We're going to have to make some hard choices, but we have to actually be increasing our spending on all of these areas and being much more efficient with how we integrate them so they're mutually reinforcing. So I think, it's better to start having the conversation now, and I do think that the British people would be receptive to it.
So, superb answer. I think two things. One, I think I might owe everybody an apology. I try to encourage disagreement on panels and specifically asked Al to try and find something to disagree with. But I also think it worked, because I think what we got as a result was an absolutely superb answer. So thank you. I think, look, to your last point about that serious dialogue with the British public, I mean, it also comes back to Al's point about there's a real risk in trying to fight the next world war with announcements, in that it gives the impression that stuff is happening when it's not really. And in some ways, it's poisonous to kind of the public discussion on this. So I think, so a small apology, but I think it was well worth the disagreement. We've got a few minutes left. I'm going to open the floor up to each of you to take, please, no more than about a minute each, if we're going to hit time. I am really interested in the action part of this. So what? What do we do now? But so last comments from each of you, and please try and be respectful of each other such that we get time for everyone.
Brilliant, thanks. So first of all, I'm kind of disappointed. I'm feeling left out. Nobody disagreed vehemently with me about flying jets in the sky, or
he hasn't finished yet.
Is that finished yet? It's going to come. I'm bracing. But no, I mean, there's three things in terms of what do we do. The action part. I think Ali's absolutely right in terms of there is a distinction between announcing what we're doing and then doing stuff. And I think at the moment, particularly when we think about UK and Japan, I think there's three areas that would see a clear implementation of the Hiroshima Accord on the back of actions that Japan has already been taking with the United States. So there is precedent to make that happen. One, through the Reciprocal Access Agreement and the Hiroshima Accord, we now know that we want to train more together, we want to operate more together, we want to open each other base infrastructure to each other. So that creates a very important opportunity to start thinking about that daily practices of industries and the large constellation of SMEs and primes that support these type of endeavors. So that by practically doing things, we identify what kind of legislation needs to be changed. How do we create connections with relevant companies? That's, for me, step number one. We have a plan of action, let's put it in place, because that will create the demand for the companies that need to support and sort of propel that kind of endeavor. The second thing, for me, regardless of whether you call it Pillar 2 or UK-Japan collaboration or GCAP, doesn't really matter. Looking sort of medium term in not the here and now, which is my first point, but the slightly beyond that, hypersonics becomes then another area, and everything that enable hypersonics as a standoff component, both in the maritime and in the airspace, that should be a priority. That is across different documents, a recurring features, a conversation that Japan has with the UK, Japan has with the United States, and the UK has with the United States, Australia, and others. So that's number two. Number three, long term. Hiroshima Accord is about propelling science and technology cooperation. And I think we need to start having a proper conversation at the university level to create these networks whereby defense and security and science innovation, it's a working group within the leading universities to enable an environment and create an ecosystem that favors that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Sophia?
The single biggest task is to get the Treasury on board with this mission. And that's the biggest piece of the pie that needs to puzzle, that needs to be, unlocked before we can achieve any of these sorts of things. But I think for me, it's about the integration agenda, whether that's the security theaters or our economic and national security, bringing together all of these different parts of the ecosystem, as Alessio's mentioned. I mean, bringing in academia, industry, government, all working much more effectively together. So it's integration, integration, integration. And, I really think that until we start, I mean, this is a radical agenda. And we've used that word a few times in semi-jest, but it is radical. And what we've been doing is we've been trying to optimize our systems to deliver on a completely different geopolitical landscape rather than embracing the disruption that we actually need to get there. We are going to have to do things in a completely different way. And the idea that it should be coming down to a situation where you have a list of projects that everybody is trying to ring fence, it's what we really need is a completely different philosophy that says all of these things need to come together. How do we build machinery of government and an institutional culture to deliver on that?
Thanks, Sophia. I don't know what happens if we overrun, Al, so you go and we'll see.
So I'm going to annoy you by agreeing with you now. So I think your point about incentives is spot on. There is a sort of lamentation about the nature of the primes and the slowness with which things get delivered, but in many ways the primes exist in the form they do because that is the optimal way to survive the procurement route. So if you do not change the incentives that exist within the system, you will continue to get the same outcomes. I think it was Churchill who said, it doesn't matter how beautiful your strategy looks, you occasionally have to look at the results. I think that one of the elements that would exist within that would also be taking seriously, going back to another of your points about those conversations, the prospect of war rather than just battles. So you cannot mobilize your entire nation for a war that has not started and hold it there, because you will just bankrupt yourself in advance of any fight happening. And if you were one of the opponents, you would just cheerfully sit and wait and watch them hemorrhage all the cash. And the population wouldn't stand for it. Not to full mobilisation. But what you can do is plan, design your economy, and start thinking about what you do need to do. So some exquisite systems you will need to hold in stockpiles. If you have rapidly evolving UAVs and other small systems, you don't need a massive stockpile. In fact, they'll become redundant over the time frame in which you hold them. So what you need to incentivise is an ecosystem that can manufacture, produce, and adapt them. And then how you keep that alive probably runs on entirely different incentives to that for exquisite systems, which requires stockpiling and the creation of the very valuable, nuclear submarine by 2032, all those sorts of bits. So I think your point about incentives and thinking about it in a long term is spot on, but it's also when you have to engage in the intellectual effort and in detail rather than just high-level assurances.
Superb. Look, if the audience enjoyed this half as much as I did, I can offer on their behalf as well as my own thank you to 3 fantastic panelists. So really excellent discussion. Thank you to all for bearing with us. Yeah, I hope everybody has a very enjoyable day. Many thanks.